Okay, hi everybody. Yeah, I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about prioritization and how to prioritize what matters for your product. I'm so excited to be here and share some of my learnings for the past couple of years. And so the three things I really want to touch on today is really starting with kind of like why prioritization is important, right? Like why are we doing it? Why does it matter? And then kind of some tips on how to create alignment in your organization to make sure everybody is kind of bought in here. And then end by kind of looking at a couple of frameworks that I personally found really helpful and that some of my peers have found really helpful. But maybe before I jump in, let me just start and quickly introduce myself. I'm Thorsten Jaeckel. I'm currently a product manager at Coinbase. Actually only joined the company a couple of weeks ago. And before that, for the last like 9 or so years, held a variety of product management and product leadership roles at Capital One, LendUp, and most recently Square. And yeah, I'm based in San Francisco, California for the last like 5 or so years. But yeah, I think that's enough about me for now. So I would say let's jump right in. And so to start, I want to actually like show you this quote. I thought it was actually really interesting. I stumbled across this a while ago, and it's from the Product Board website. They're a software company that built tools helping with product management, prioritization, especially. And I thought this was really interesting and really resonated with me. And it says prioritization in product management is the disciplined process of evaluating the relative importance of work ideas and requests to eliminate wasteful practices and deliver customer value in the quickest possible way, given a variety of constraints. So there's a lot going on there, but I actually underlined 3 sections that I thought were particularly interesting and critical, right? And so one is discipline process, second is deliver customer value, and the third one is constraints. And I just want to go ahead and unpack each of these a little bit more and share why I think they're actually important. And so on the process side, I like the key here is really you want to have something in place that's objective and that's objective and that your stakeholders can actually like understand. And so right, like essentially because what you want to get at is if you make these decisions, you want your stakeholders, your peers, your team to actually know why the decisions were made. And so it doesn't look like you just decided to do X because you thought it was a good idea, but you want there to be a process in place to actually arrive at that idea, and others should be able to understand that. And then the second part here, delivering customer value and constraints kind of go really nicely hand in hand. Because if you think about like in a scenario where you would have unlimited resources, which is obviously unrealistic, but let's pretend for a second you do, right? Like you could theoretically just build everything you want, right? Like every feature you could even like think of. But then should you actually do that? Probably not, right? Because a lot of what you would build would have very marginal or like non-existent customer value at the end. And so you would be much better off to build something else. And since you actually never have unlimited resources, right, this becomes really important this becomes really important to figure out kind of what are the things that drive the most customer value. You focus on those first, and then you start kind of cutting and trimming things at the bottom that don't actually necessarily deliver to the value prop of the product. And then on the value side, I think like an interesting or important concept here that we'll use a lot later in the frameworks is return on investment, right? It's really all about that because you want to figure out where can you invest your resources to get the highest possible return. So moving on, there we go. Yeah, moving on. I couldn't resist throwing a little Gilbert cartoon in there. I think they have some great content usually, and prioritization is no exception. And so I think like I'll give you a second to just like read through this. But yeah, I think essentially right what this cartoon really underlines is constraints, right? Like we established before that you can't really get everything done, right? Like you have to make decisions on what is important. But if you actually say, hey, I have 100 projects, and then you take 90 of them and consider them as P1 or P0 importances, then that doesn't really help, right? Because you're still not going to be able to do anything or everything. And so in a nutshell, this is really what prioritization is about, right? It's not just rank ordering projects from 1 to n. It's also really figuring out, okay, how much can I actually done? Where do I draw the line? And kind of making that tough decision on deciding what to what to not do. Cool. So I think now that we essentially established why we do want to prioritize, why we should prioritize, let's actually jump into some of the foundational pieces that's really good to have in place to actually create alignment in your organization. And I think each of these could probably be its own webinar, and so I can't do them full justice, but definitely wanted to touch on two that I personally found extremely helpful in the past. And so one, I think I want to start with a product vision and mission. I think it's really important to actually have this in place, and it really helps you drive alignment within your company. And so let's maybe take a step back actually on clarifying like what a vision, what a mission is, and how the two are kind of related. And so generally, if you look at a product vision, it describes kind of a future position or state of a company or product, right? It's really the why we do what we do. And then the mission is kind of like one level below that. So mission describes what are we doing to make, sorry, the mission describes what we're doing to make the vision a reality. So essentially, what are the products and the features we're building to get to this state? And then you generally have a layer below that. We're not going to go into that too much, which is strategy. And then the strategy talks about the how. And maybe like looking at an example, like if I take Coinbase, where I work right now, like Coinbase's vision is to provide economic freedom for every person in business. And then their mission is to build an open financial system for the world. So you can kind of see how those two fit nicely together. Right? We build an open financial system for the world because that enables economic freedom for every person. Or if you look at like Google, for example, their vision is to provide access to the world's information in one click. And then their mission is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And so I think it's another good example of how these two tie really nicely together. But you might actually ask, right, like, okay, what, like we're talking about vision and mission, but how does that actually relate to prioritization, right? Like, why is it important here? And in my mind, I think there's three kind of like main aspects why I think having this in place is super helpful. First of all, this gives you a North Star. Think about it as you're aligning with your team and your leadership in the product company on kind of the purpose and the overarching goal of the product. And by having that, you really establish a common ground with your team. And if you think about it on the flip side, not having that makes it really hard to make like really like in-depth, like detailed decisions, right? And so you really want to establish that common ground, establish that North Star. And then the second one, just kind of related here, is it helps you to filter, right? So think about, you're now considering new products or new features. You have this North Star in place, you can actually quickly check against it, right? Like, does this new feature actually fit in here? If so, that's awesome, right? Let's continue kind of moving it through the process. If not, maybe like pause it for now, right? You can kind of put it on the side. You can kind of like revisit this once in a while, but don't spend too much time on things that don't directly relate to the mission or vision right now. And then the last but not least, I think there's a point around giving meaning to your work, right? So like everybody on your team comes to work every day. They're like putting in like long hours, hard work to kind of get the product to where you want it to be. But by actually being able to tie back their work to the mission and the vision, that really gives their work a lot more meaning. And it can actually really help make a team feel more motivated and more energetic. And then maybe one last thing here is, I would say a vision and mission doesn't necessarily just need to be at the company level, right? I went over examples for Coinbase and Google, which are at the highest kind of like corporate level, but you can also have missions or visions at a product, right? Like if you own one product, for example, like the investment experience at Coinbase, you can create a mission for that particular product that ties into the corporate vision, and then use the product vision to drive prioritization and alignment. And then, so the next really important thing is, really briefly want to touch on is success metrics, or like metrics even in general. And so, like, I think this should probably be relatively obvious, but I've definitely seen this also like go wrong in a few spots, and that's why I wanted to just like talk about this briefly. And so you really should always think about, right, like what are the success metrics for your product, because ultimately you should always want to measure, right, like how's my product doing? Is it actually achieving what it's supposed to achieve? And if it's working well, and you generally do that, right, like by asking customers and by looking at metrics. And then the second part is, as you think about new products and new features, you should at this ideation phase really think about, okay, what are the success metrics, right? Like, how do I know if this is going to actually achieve what it's supposed to achieve or not? Because I mean, I think it's good practice to do that, right? I think it's gives the process a little bit more rigor, a little bit more discipline. You're not just launching something and then figuring out, okay, what works kind of ex post. You're really putting in the thinking up front, which will give you kind of a better proposal. But then secondly, success metrics are also super important as you go into a prioritization, because a lot of frameworks, and we'll start looking at those in a second, like we'll have a notion of like a return or value you're generating or measuring. And so you really need to have this success metric or like, yeah, success criteria in place to actually like properly prioritize and estimate a project against those. And then I think another note here is, right, like you don't always have to completely reinvent the wheel. Like a lot of times, if you look at success metrics, or like for initiative or product, right, you can look at like what stage the company is in, like where in the customer life cycle are you, right? Are you looking, is this more like acquisition, activation, retention, referral, revenue? Like what industry are you in, right? Like if let's say you're launching a new SaaS product, right, you can kind of look at, okay, what are other SaaS companies generally looking for like success metrics? And so you can always like start kind of by benchmarking to get a good idea of like what has worked for other companies, what has worked for your companies, and then kind of like take it from there. Because I think the challenge here is we live in a world of like a lot of data, right? And so it's super easy to be able to get 50 or 100 metrics about your product, but it's actually pretty hard to get to what are the 1 to 3 or 1 to 5 metrics that actually really matter, because it's not reasonable to necessarily track 100 metrics and be super actionable on each of those. And so that's why distilling it to like those key success metrics is really important and a really good exercise to do early in the life cycle. Cool. And so I think we essentially have a good foundation in place now, and I think if you do these last two things, you have a really good alignment with your organization on what you should prioritize against and why it's important. So I would say let's actually start taking a look at a couple of frameworks that you can leverage. And so there's two groups here that I want to discuss. The first two frameworks fall into the bucket of like ROI, return on investment focused, and then I have two more that are more user focused at the end. And I think both of them are useful. Both have their pros and cons, and we can have a little bit of a discussion again around both of those. But I want to start with ROI type frameworks. I think they're a little bit simpler and easier to use. They can be like, they don't need as much necessary prep work. And the simplest of the ROI type frameworks is probably this one. It's called value versus effort, or you'll sometimes see this also referred as value versus complexity. And as you can see here, it's essentially it's a two-dimensional matrix, and you're plotting how much value you anticipate from an initiative against how much effort it will be to actually implement it. And then you essentially take each initiative or each feature and you estimate it against those two dimensions, and you end up plotting it on this grid. And the goal you're pretty much pursuing here is identifying where can you get the highest value for the lowest effort, right? That's this like section up there on the left, like in the blue circle. Those are kind of the projects you really want to focus on, right? Like high customer value, low effort, that's the sweet spot. And then kind of on the opposite side, you have high effort, low value. Those are the things you generally want to stay away from, right? Like there's always exceptions to the rule, but in general, you want to kind of get the biggest bang for your buck and focus on high ROI projects. But then I think the one thing I want to go in a little bit is how do you actually estimate value and effort, right? Because clearly once you have those estimates, it's super easy to plot this and kind of visualize this, but getting to the estimate of a value and effort is the critical piece here. And one thing that let's say works here is really well, because you're essentially plotting this on a matrix, you need a standardized scale, right? You can't necessarily say, okay, project A gives me 50 million in revenue, project B gives me 8,000 users. That's hard to plot, right? Because what does 50 million revenue versus 8,000 users, like how does that work? And so one thing you can do is either force everything into one metric, right? So you say, okay, the only thing that ultimately matters is revenue. So every project gets translated into revenue, and then you use that as your value scale. But that's not necessarily always possible. So the other thing you can do is use a standardized, more abstracted scale. So for example, you can have a value estimate of like 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, and then have value being more like an order of magnitude type type metric. And then the second thing here, effort, I think is a little bit more straightforward. In most cases, I would say effort is usually just like estimating person time for like your product, engineering, design, maybe data science functions. But essentially you want to take the time investment for the technical teams bringing this solution to life. And again, and you just have to decide on, like, are you doing this in days and weeks or months, and keep that consistent, but ultimately plot it that way. And if you use the abstracted scale for value, you can also use an abstracted scale for effort, but again, it's not 100% necessary. And I think like this is true for all of these frameworks, and something I also like deeply believe in. I think you should always like take these as kind of a starting point, right? I think you should never take a framework as, oh, this is how it's in the textbook, I have to exactly use it that way. I always found that these work best if you actually make them your own, right? Like you take what's in there, you play around with it, you experiment with it, and then you kind of like find your own sort of, you kind of define your own framework based on what works for you. And so then the next one I want to like talk about a little bit is RISE. So it's also an ROI type framework. It was developed by a company called Intercom a couple of years ago, and I actually view it as an evolution of the value versus effort framework, because it still has effort as a component, but what it does is it takes value and breaks it down into three subcomponents: reach, impact, and confidence. And what it actually does, what that does is it makes it a little bit easier and a little bit more objective to actually estimate value, because right, you're no longer estimating this one kind of really complex abstract number that on which pretty much everything depends, but you're starting to estimate like three components, and then you're multiplying them together. The one thing to note here, right, like since we're now having 4 dimensions, you can't necessarily plot this anymore, right? A 4D visualization would be a little bit overkill and really hard to grasp. And so what RISE does is it actually produces a numerical output where you take reach times impact times confidence divided by effort. And so every project ends up with a numerical score, and then you just stack rank based on that score. And that's I would say in an ideal world, that stack ranked list is then the sequence you want to kind of do work against. But I think there's always exceptions to the rule, right? Like RISE doesn't also necessarily like capture every dependency or every like synergy between projects. And so you could find yourself in a world where you might not want to do a project 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in that order. It might make more sense to do 1, 2, 5, 4, 3, for example, because there's more synergies of like doing things like sequentially or in parallel. And so you can then always like start deviating, but it's always good to know kind of what the idealized order would look like. And then let's take a second to actually look a little bit at how would we estimate reach, impact, and confidence. And so reach is probably the most difficult here, where like essentially what you're trying to get at is you're trying to estimate how many users are you actually getting this feature or this product in front of. And the critical thing here is to keep this at a constant unit of time across all of your initiatives. So for example, if you're doing quarterly planning, you're calculating your RISE scores for the quarterly process, and you want to look at, okay, how many customers per quarter does a certain feature reach? And that's important because that helps you normalize between features that are recurring versus features that are one time. And so yeah, you estimate that number to the best of your ability. I always believe that you don't necessarily need to go into the exact number. Like you can stick to order of magnitude, right? Is this reaching 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, etc. customers? Doesn't really matter if you're reaching 54 or 57. And then the next one is that you're looking at here is impact. And so impact is really measuring or trying to get a sense for how much are you moving the key metric, or how much are you impacting the business. And because that's really, really tricky to measure, what is done in the RISE framework, actually, it's really smart. You're not like trying to estimate that directly, but you're actually just estimating it on a scale in terms of order of magnitude. And so you're pretty much saying, okay, you have a scale from 0.5 for low to 3 for massive, and every project kind of gets put somewhere on that score, like 0.5, 1, 2, or 3, and the scale kind of denotes the like endpoint. So like, what would be a really low, like pretty meaningless impact to your business that gets a 0.5, and then what's kind of this game changer, like step function change for the business that gets you to pushes you to the next level, that's a massive, and then you put other things in between. And so I think it helps a little bit getting false precision out of your estimates, and it kind of gives you that like standardized framework there. And then the next one is confidence. So it's pretty self-explanatory, but essentially you're scaling your reach times impact by a scalar to kind of layer in potential uncertainty, right? So there's essentially what you use is most of the time, like you use 100% for high, 80 for medium, 50% for low. And I would say most projects generally get a medium, right? Like you have 80% pretty confident, but they can always, like, things can happen. And then you can use 100% for things where you're pretty sure, like you've tested this, you have a ton of empirical data, you've done this before, you kind of know exactly what's going to happen, but you probably use that fairly like rarely. And then anything where you can't even be 50% sure, now you're really in like moonshot territory, right? And I feel like getting moonshots through these like regular prioritization processes is definitely a little bit tricky, and you should really like, yeah, you'd really like question, right? Is it the right project to do at this time? Or you can always like prioritize it outside of kind of like a framework, because you shouldn't necessarily say, okay, I have a 10% likelihood of believing this. It's going to be a massive impact. I'll do it over a bunch of like 100% confidence, high impact projects. That might not be the right thing to do for the business at that time. And so I think those are usually like, usually want to have a more strategic conversation around those. And then lastly, effort. It's essentially the same as in the last, like the value versus effort framework, but the only distinction on RISE, the recommendation is to use person month rounded up to the next integer. So let's say you have 6 engineering weeks, you would end up using 2 as the effort for the project. And then, yeah, as I said earlier, you take reach, you multiply it by impact by confidence, and then you divide the whole thing by effort, and that then gives you your stack ranked list. Cool, and then let's switch gears a little bit and jump into 2 frameworks that look at more of the customer rather than kind of pure like ROI and metrics. And the 2 I want to discuss is Moscow and Kano. And so let's start with Moscow. It's a pretty common framework. It's really simple, but actually really, really powerful. And so essentially in Moscow, or I guess really MSCW, but it doesn't sound as good, so everybody calls it Moscow. What you really want to look at is you take features and you bucket them into 4 categories. And you ask pretty much a couple of questions around each feature to determine which of these categories should it fall into. And so the first one is your must-haves. Those are really like non-negotiable product needs or features, and they're mandatory. And you can almost view those as like, that's the MVP, right? Like without those, you cannot ship the product because it may not work, it may not be legal, it may not be safe, right? Like for example, let's say you're doing something on a blockchain and you're like deciding, hey, you know what, I'm gonna cut having safe cold storage, right? Like that probably doesn't warrant shipping the product, because somebody's just gonna hack you and steal all your customers' crypto. And so you don't want to like launch without it. So that would be a true must-have. Or like on a lending product, like having all the required like licensing and stuff like that in place, because otherwise you're just breaking the law by offering something that's not legal potentially in a state. And then the next category is your should have projects or should have initiatives. And so these are like usually really important. They can be really like differentiating or like delighting. They add a lot of value, but the product actually works without them. And like you can probably launch without most of these, and it may not be right, like it may not be perfect, but it might still be enough to kind of get you into the market, get you testing, collect data. And some of these you can potentially get around with manual workarounds, right? Like think about, again, I've spent a lot of time working in lending, so I tend to go back to like lending examples, but let's say you're launching a new product and you're not building out all sort of like self-serve functionality, you're relying a lot on the customer calling you for some of the edge cases. That might be fine, especially initially, right? You're not having that many customers. You can just have a customer support representative deal with this. But as you scale, you want to probably go ahead and build those out because it's a better experience and it's cheaper for you as well. And so then the next bucket is could haves. These are really kind of the nice to have. So I think they're often not like directly related to the core function of the product. The customer might not actually notice they're missing. They might not even know they want this. And so I think those are nice kind of like features to kind of like invest in to really differentiate and create something unique. But you definitely want this to be kind of one of the smaller buckets. So the bulk should be like your must-haves and should-haves. And then once you have all of them exhausted, I think the interesting question becomes, are you investing in could-haves for this product? Or is it actually more impactful to go build another product and kind of start again with must-haves from there? And then will not have. I think it's a really good output of this framework. It essentially helps you explicitly state kind of what are the non-goals for this iteration, right? So you kind of start by, okay, this is what I must have, what I should have, what I could have, and then everything that doesn't fit in those buckets or that you kind of start deprioritizing cutting, you can put in will not have. Lets you keep a nice record of it. You can always come back to it for like V2 or V3, but it keeps it really nice and clean, and you can actually focus on the three prior buckets. And I mentioned some of these examples earlier, but yeah, for example, on the lending product, right, like must-haves, I think would be things like the customer applies, right, your risk rules, your decisioning, like your money movement, your system of record, like really these critical pieces without which it wouldn't work. Like, right, what good would a credit card be if you can't actually spend money or repay it? And then, yeah, should have, I think I touched on like self-serve capabilities or like automatic payments, like they're really great to have. And I think they're needed for having a good experience, but you can kind of launch and maybe add them a few months later. And then could have, so I think you don't necessarily need a standalone mobile app to like service a loan, right? Like not everything needs an app. Mobile web might actually be fine. Or like pre-filling the application for a second loan, like customers can also just type it in again. I think like these are really more like, okay, if you really want to optimize around the edges and polish, then you can kind of go towards those. And then another interesting thing here is, and we'll get into this a little bit more in the end, but there's actually also a really good opportunity to start combining frameworks, right? So you have Moscow to kind of highlight what is must have, should have, could have. And now you can actually use within each of these buckets another framework like RISE or value versus effort to start stack ranking, right? It might not be as meaningful in must have because you need all of those anyways, right? So you should probably just sequence them in whatever way makes sense. But as you look at should haves and could haves, you could then actually see, okay, which of these should haves give me the most value or have the lowest investment, and in which order should I do them? Because likely somewhere in the like S and C category is where you have to draw the line, right? You're not going to get through all of that. And so that's why I think kind of creating these hybrid frameworks gets really interesting. Cool. And then the last one I want to talk about is called the Kano model. And so it's actually a really interesting framework. It's been around far longer than any of the other ones. Actually, it's developed by a Japanese researcher called Noriko Kano in the 70s or 80s. So this is definitely not a new framework, but it's actually really relevant today and probably more relevant than ever. And so the core premise here is really that it challenges the conventional belief that improving every aspect of a product leads to an increase in customer satisfaction. And so what you do here is you're kind of starting to plot initiatives on this like 2-axis grid where you're mapping investment from like, okay, you're not doing this at all, just some basic features to you're building it as best in class. And then on the vertical axis, you're tracking, okay, how satisfied is the customer? I think the challenge here is that, like, as you can probably see already, this is not necessarily easy to get information. So this requires you to actually have in-depth conversations with your customers or do questionnaires and present them with, hey, here's all the features I'm thinking about. If this was present or not present, how do you feel about that? That's generally how these questionnaires are structured. And so you then get a sense for, okay, for all the features I have, where do they kind of fall on this spectrum? And then depending kind of where they sit on the spectrum, you essentially have three buckets of features, right? And so let's start by looking at the first one, which is basic features. They also sometimes called threshold features. And so these are things that the user essentially expects to be there, right? So like I think they're in a sense similar to the must-haves, where without them, your product won't likely succeed, because not having these will mean there's a lot of like dissatisfaction, right? You can kind of see this in the lower left quadrant here, where if you have not invested at all in a basic feature, or like a feature as a basic expectation, your customer is really not going to like the product and likely not going to use it. And so, but as you can also see, as you kind of get through like a basic level of investment, there's a very like limited increase afterwards. And so for basic features, it's really important to understand where to draw the line, because the core premise is that these will never like create delight. They will never kind of go past like a neutral. And so I think a few good examples here are, let's maybe go one is from I read about this a while ago. I found it was super interesting. One interesting example here is if you look at the hotel industry, like usually hotel rooms have like hot water instantly available, right? You go to the bathroom, you open the faucet, you have hot water within like seconds, like 2 or 3 seconds. And hotels are actually spending a lot of money and energy and infrastructure on making that happen, right? It's not actually a trivial engineering problem to solve, to get hot water instantaneously at 3 a.m. in the morning on the 19th floor of a hotel. So it requires a lot of engineering. And no customer is actually going to give you a positive review for that, right? Like you never read on TripAdvisor or Yelp, oh, this hotel was amazing, they had hot water like instantly. But on the flip side, if you actually don't do this, and every time you go to the faucet or the shower, you open it, you have to wait for a minute for hot water to come out, you will probably read about that in reviews, right? Like customers would not be happy about that. Another one is, right, like you can look at like something like a turn signal in a car, right? I think nobody's gonna say, oh wow, this is an amazing new car, it has a turn signal, but imagine you left it out or like it wasn't functioning. I mean, apart from that probably being illegal and your car not being able to get registered in any country, but like nobody would buy it, right? And so that's why basic features never create high satisfaction. They're really getting you to this threshold of, okay, this product is now meeting the base level acceptance, and that's it. The other challenge is customers also never tell you about this, right? If you just ask somebody, hey, describe the perfect hotel room for me, right? They will go into every little thing, but nobody will mention hot water, just like nobody will mention the turn signal in the car. And then the next category I want to look at is the opposite, the delighting features, or sometimes they also call it excitement features. And these are the exact opposite of the spectrum. And so those are the things that really delight and wow the customer. And sometimes you might not even need much investment, right? Like, because these kind of like strictly start above the neutral line. So doing a little bit of work here might like really create a positive like experience. Since we did hotels earlier, right, let's stick to hotel examples. I'm not sure if you've been to like a Hilton DoubleTree before, but like one of the things they do is they give you on check-in, you get like a warm, like essentially freshly baked like chocolate chip cookie. Really cheap for them to do, right? Like unit cost of a couple of cents, like able to mass produce, really not a big logistical or investment effort, but it's actually a really nice experience, right? You just come out of your long plane ride, you go to a taxi, you stand there, check in, you get a chocolate cookie, you're happy, right? It's kind of it's a really nice little touch. And so you now created something where you added very little investment, but you created a really positive experience. Yeah, and so I think then one thing that's interesting here as well is, it was a really interesting insight from this framework, is that features don't necessarily stay static in these categories, right? So let's stick to the cookie example for a second. Let's say you go to a DoubleTree like every month, and every month you get your cookie. And now, like after a year of coming, you're no longer necessarily delighted by getting the cookie, right? It's really you're expecting it to be there. And so this actually moved all the way down here now to basic expectations, because imagine like in the 12th time or 10th time you come to the hotel, suddenly they're no longer giving you a cookie. There's no explanation, nothing, you just don't get it. You're not going to be like, oh, okay, like you're not going to be like delighted anymore, obviously, and you're probably less happy now than you were before getting the cookie for the first time. Because before you got it for the first time, you didn't actually know you're getting it, so you were neutral. Now you were expecting it, and you're not getting it, so you're probably like a little bit less well off than neutral. And so that's why where a lot of features over time move from delighters to basic expectations. And that's just one thing to keep in mind, that you can't easily take away a feature you added as a delighter, because it becomes to be expected. And then the third category in the middle, these are the satisfiers, or sometimes also called performance features. These are essentially things that have kind of a proportionate increase, right? So like the more you invest in them, the better they get. And you need probably at least some sort of basic investment to meet kind of a neutral satisfaction. And I think good examples here are, if you look at like a hotel room, it's like the size, right? Like if you rent somebody like a little broom closet of like 50 square feet, they're obviously not going to be happy. But once you hit a certain threshold, you're good. But then honestly, like the bigger you make a room, the more satisfaction you get out of it, right? I think that's the entire concept around like suites and everything. Same on like in the software world. If you look at like cloud storage, you're always happy about more, right? Like somebody suddenly gives you 2 terabyte instead of 1 terabyte for your cloud drive. That's amazing, right? You have more satisfaction because you get more value out of it. And so, and I would say like those are also, satisfiers are also the features that the customers know they want, right? Like those are the things that they actually base the decisions off, right? Like they pick the hotel room based on how big the room is, like how many stars it has. They pick cloud storage based on the upload and download speed, or based on the actual like storage amount, versus kind of basic expectations. Those are more like the things that need to be in place, but they're not like consciously being used to make the decision. But yeah, I think that's all I had on the Kano model. And so like the next, I have like just a couple more slides. The last thing I really want to touch on, and I mentioned this earlier a little bit, is I think the fun in here is really, right, like essentially build your own framework. Like there isn't really, I generally found like there isn't a lot of frameworks that work like right out of the box, right? Like, and especially not for 100% of scenarios. And so like what you really want to do is like just adapt or combine like different elements of frameworks, like really kind of experiment, try things, iterate, and kind of like figure out what works for you, right? Like, because a lot of times, as I mentioned earlier, you can, for example, combine a framework that looks more at the user, like Moscow, with a framework that looks at ROI, and then kind of merge the two together, and that gets you really powerful results. And ultimately, too, I think one thing that can't be like underestimated is that the need for prioritization, or the need for how rigorous prioritization needs to be, changes a lot with the company stage, right? Like let's imagine for a second you're in a small startup like Series Seed or Series A. You're the only PM, and there's like 4 or 5 engineers. You don't need this like really like big blown out like massive process, right? Like all you really need is yeah, all you really need is having a little bit of a framework in place that kind of like makes it understandable for the founders, for the stakeholders on what's going on. And you can kind of just have a very lightweight prioritization. But now as your organization grows, as the company grows, you really want to you want to kind of move to something a little bit more robust, because like you might have to like combine input from like 10 different PMs, and everybody has their own prioritization decisions. And so I think having something more standardized in place here definitely helps. But I think so in general, I would say, right, like really experiment, really try, and kind of like create something that works for you, right? Like don't just use a framework the way it is because you read about it. I think it's perfectly fine to kind of make adjustments here. And then, yeah, I think just before we before we recap, just wanted to like share one other takeaway, and like one other quote unquote method of prioritization, and obviously joking, right? But I think there is a danger of this actually still happening, right? This is called Hippo Prioritization, the highest paid person's opinion. And even if you have data, even if you have a process in place, this can still happen, and it's definitely definitely something to be aware of. So definitely really make sure that, right, like, you don't just get your peers and your team on board, but also really get your leadership team bought in, right? Because without your leadership team being bought in, it's gonna be really hard to actually avoid this, right? And some executive walking in and saying, you know what, we're gonna build this product. And you did all this work on like deciding which one to build, and they just come in and override the decision. And you just want to kind of like preempt that by having a really kind of like having a lot of alignment around why you're doing this. Great. And then just to wrap up here, yeah, I think on the takeaway side, I think I would really say, right, like start with a product vision and mission. Like, I feel like I almost can't stress how important it is to have this, and it's actually also really like a really good kind of exercise for a team to go through, right? If you do this for your product, if it already exists for a company, it's going to be a really good exercise for you and your engineering team or your cross-functional partners to actually go through and set up. And then second, right, like this, like like try to be as metrics driven as you can, base your decisions off metrics, and then essentially define and track success metrics for your products. And then as we just talked about, right, like prioritization is a really iterative process. There isn't I think you'll never get to a state where like, oh, this is perfect now. This is the process that I'm going to use for the rest of my career over the next like 5 or 10 years. I would really view it as it's kind of an ever-changing, ever-evolving thing, and it changes with your product, with your team, with your company, and you want to just make adjustments and tweaks to it to kind of make sure it stays kind of like fresh and up to date. And then lastly, I would really say, right, like always make the framework fit the problem, not the other way around. So like, don't force a problem to fit your framework. Like take the framework and force it to fit your problem, so you get the most value out of it. But yeah, that's all I had for today. Yeah, I hope you found this helpful. Hope you found it enjoyable. And yeah, if you have any questions, I put my LinkedIn address on here, so definitely feel free to reach out, and happy to chat more. Thank you.